Hello and welcome to our last seminar series for this semester. Somehow, for some reason, I always think that the last is not the end. Today we have Stuart Dunn, who is senior lecturer at the Department of Digital Humanities in King's College London, and he is also the deputy director now of the department in King's College. And you have a background in geography, Stuart, and in archaeology. Yeah, sorry. Archaeology and geography, and you have recently published A History of Place in the Digital Age, which is a book that is published by Routledge, and it's part of the series Digital Research in the Arts and Humanities, which is precisely about spatial analysis. I need to apologize to you, Stuart. We have these graduations going on, and it's going to be a little bit like occasional rave party here. So just so you...
That's okay. A good backdrop.
And today you will talk to us about telling stories with GIS, from structured gazetteers to spatial narrative. We're very happy to have you here. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much, Anna, for that introduction. Thank you for coming along this afternoon, and thank you very much for having me to Uppsala. This is not my first time in Sweden. It is my first time in Uppsala. I had no idea you had weather like this in Sweden. It's pouring with rain in London at the moment for President Trump's state visit, but there we go. Anyway, I want to talk this afternoon about an area of my research that I've been focusing on and off on for around 5 years now. A lot of these arguments are summarised in the book, which Anna referred to, A History of Place in the Digital Age. There are a couple of spare copies here, which you can have a peruse at, and there's one going around here if you like. There are also some flyers, which you're welcome to take away. There is also a 20% discount code on the completely outrageous cover price, if anyone is interested to that extent. But I'm primarily going to talk about the structure of geographic data, how the World Wide Web and the Internet deal with the structure of geographic data, but also how humanist scholars in particular can contribute to the discussion of how the World Wide Web deals with geodata. Because I think, there is a very long history of engagement of humanities scholars and thinking about space discursively. But we're only just now beginning to see those discussions leaching over into consideration of modern digital culture and modern digital society. And for me, this is very, very much where this emerging discipline that we call digital humanities might sit. So I have two main arguments that I want to make this afternoon. The first is that breaking down the physical and the cognitive worlds into spatial chunks is something that we all do as human beings. We do it as humanists, we do it as archivists, as information scholars, from whatever perspective that we're coming to. The idea of the gazetteer has emerged from this need to break down the world into manageable chunks. But I also want to make the argument that those lists, those data sets, those gazetteers encode our own human biases. And that's where we need the skills and the discussions of the humanities to kind of understand those biases. So, my research adopts a very historical perspective to these questions. And the idea of breaking down the world into what can be measured versus what can be experienced is a concept which goes back at least to classical Greece and the writings of Claudius Ptolemy, who wrote the Geographic. And he makes this distinction between geography, this pure mathematical quantitative science of measuring the world through various methodologies, and chorography, or choreographia, which is the world as it is experienced. So this is a very, very important distinction. It is a philosophical as well as a historical distinction. And in Ptolemy's mind's eye, geography, the measurable, is always infinitely superior. Now, there are a lot of reasons for this, I think. Mainly, I would suspect, because the idea of the world being measurable and quantifiable appeals to the idea of the Greek ideal. The fact that just as in statuary, the physical and the plastic arts, in philosophy and poetry, there is always an apex which the philosopher or the artist or the sculptor is trying to achieve. And the measured world represents the kind of the acme of that ideal. So, this is where the idea of the gazetteer comes in. So the gazetteer has historically been understood as a measured list, a quantified list of places, a set of places which somehow or other has been reduced to a set of records, which can have whatever kind of attributes associated with those records, be it a place name, be it different varieties of place name, be it a latitude and longitude, be it an administrative district, and so forth. These are all ultimately attributes which, in Ptolemy's perspective, would be measurable. They are quantifiable. They're nothing to do with what we as people might experience those places as. And gazetteers in this day and age are a fundamental part of the World Wide Web and Internet infrastructure. Now, I know you can't read any of this because it's too small, but that's okay, you don't need to. This blue category here is corresponding, as it says there, to geography. And you can see there are actually quite a few blue points in this schematic infrastructure of the world semantic web in this case. So lists of places, lists of geographic entities are essentially used to tie bits and pieces of the internet together using common references to places. We use these every day in our daily lives. If you use Google Earth or Google Maps to navigate from one place to another, you are using Google's gazetteer, but you are also then referencing in sources from other places at the same time. The lists of places which connect those ideas are the blue points in this schematic map of the web. But as I say, however, my interest is in how gazetteers, as building blocks of how we tell stories, how we can use those ideas, how we can use them as sort of partial and subjective ways of expressing subjective information. Now, again, my work takes a very historical perspective, and this is an idea which has been implicit in a number of discourses from very, very early periods of time. It's an idea that comes through implicitly in various schools of Greek rhetoric. So this is part of a very cheerful soundtrack to this lecture that we have here. So I'll try and time the cheerful bits to the parties going past, just to make things run a bit smoother. So this is a handbook for students of rhetoric, which was written by Aphthonius, the progymnesmata, Aphthonius of Rhodes, and it's a series of exercises for students who are learning the art and science of rhetoric. And this is from the section of the progymnesmata on ekphrasis, the science, the rhetorical science of expressing places through words. And this is a description, a notional description of the citadel at Alexandria, which the student would have been required to recite in such a way as to take the reader, the listener rather, to that place in their mind's eye. And what we see throughout this passage, throughout this description, is a set of kind of connecting incidental phrases, points in the narrative where the mind's eye is pulled off in a different direction. Now, in my historically informed idea of what a gazetteer is, so I find it very hard to stay still when I'm speaking, so I'll do my best. I'll just try and stand behind this table and not move. In this, in my sort of historically informed idea of what we should think of as a gazetteer, this is as much a list of places, a list of records of place, you know, as a list of place names that we would see on the semantic web. So this, I would suggest, forces us to rethink the idea of a gazetteer as an infrastructure. I would say a gazetteer should be a means of understanding spatial discourse. Okay, we have to think about individual units of place in discourses as a series of measurable records. Now, this brings us to the question of how human perception and human partiality is brought into those series of records if we start thinking of humanities discourse in that way. One might think of this not so much as gazetteers as infrastructures, but as infrastructures of understanding. That's probably the best way of putting it. Now, when I was researching this book, I looked in some detail into the history of the idea of the gazetteer, because I thought that that would be a useful way of thinking in a meta sense about the ways in which gazetteers frame our understanding. And the word gazetteer itself has its origins in the early 17th century from the idea of the Gazette, which is one of these originally fairly informal publications which, you know, were bought out to describe a whole different set of contemporary issues and news items and so forth. So this is really, you know, the idea of the gazetteer actually has its roots in journalism. And one rather kind of lovely theory behind the origin of the term itself is the word gazette actually refers to the penny coin used to pay for the periodical, deriving originally from the Italian Gaza, or a magpie, who is the thief that steals the coin. Okay? I don't quite know 100% of this is true. I would absolutely love it if it were, of course. But the term gazetteer is initially not a noun. It's not, or it is a noun, but it's not a list of places. It actually derives from gazettier, which is a person who writes a gazette. So it is a professional title rather than, you know, a list of places. Now, the earliest, should I say, reference that I could find to the actual term gazetteer, spelt like that, was in this 1704 contribution by Laurence Échard called The Gazetteers or the Newsman's Interpreter, then being this complete geographical index of all the major places of Europe. And so, you know, this kind of sort of gives us an idea of where this kind of term comes from. So the idea of the gazetteer as a record of places, so it comes from this rather journalistic background. And I think that immediately invites us to revisit and reconsider the supposed objectivity of gazetteers as lists of places, you know, especially in these days of fake news and so forth. Now, the idea of gazetteer was, after this period, very much adopted as a mechanism and an instrument of empire, not least by the Empire of Great Britain. Now, of course, the Empire of Great Britain underwent a great deal of expansion and consolidation in the 19th century, overseen rather, very much by men like Herbert Horatio Kitchener, who we have here, one of the most famous moustachiers in history, arguably. So, now, Kitchener is most famously remembered as the commander of British forces in the First World War, and of course for the famous recruitment poster saying "Your country needs you." But much earlier in his career, in 1875, he was posted to the new British acquisition of Cyprus, with specifically the task of creating a modern scientific gazetteer and map of the island. And in a letter which I found from Kitchener to his boss, Sir Robert Biddulph, should I say, the governor of Cyprus, in the National Archives in London, he spends quite a lot of time complaining that he's been sent to Cyprus to undertake this rather wishy-washy, lackluster, semi-civilian role of making a map of the island, where he'd much rather be fighting the Turks or whatever in Palestine. But he did nonetheless, in 1882, produce the first kind of scientific quality map of the island in these 15 sheets with every place name very carefully documented, every place of religious worship carefully documented, every kind of feature carefully documented. Now, this was a huge advance in map making at the time. I think it had a very considerable influence on the development of the United Kingdom's Ordnance Survey Department. Unfortunately, we can't document this history at all because all the relevant archives were lost when the Ordnance Survey headquarters building was hit by a Nazi bomb in World War II, so all the archival material relating to this was destroyed then. But I think the fact that the modern gazetteer, the modern kind of imperial gazetteer as we know it, has its roots in Cyprus, is really, really interesting, because Cyprus is, of course, very much a divided island. It has Turkish place names, it has Greek place names, all of which have to be dealt with kind of very carefully and very sensitively, although these were not factors which bothered Kitchener very much, I suspect. The main purpose of why Kitchener had been commissioned to construct this map was for the purposes of taxation and administration. Because after 300 years of Turkish rule, where there had been no formal bureaucracy, the gazetteer had that very, very specific purpose. Now, this is a set of considerations which have played a key role in more recent times in Cyprus, particularly after the Turkish annexation of the north of the island in 1974. Partly as the kind of the rebuilding and the peacekeeping operation following this annexation, the United Nations commissioned a gazetteer of Cypriot place names, which stands in stark contrast to the approach that Kitchener took. So in 1983, the complete Gazetteer of Cyprus, this UN-sanctioned document, was published. And in the foreword to this document, the then Minister for Education of the Republic of Cyprus, this was in the edition, published in 1987, frames the gazetteer in these extremely inclusive terms. He says, the toponyms of Cyprus refer to the peaceful works of the people and to their relations with the environment. No names relating to war, hatred, division, and lack of communication occur. And then he says the toponyms constitute a kind of inscription engraved on the soil. So I think, this move away from partiality, informed by circumstance, gives us an insight into, in a way, the epistemology of the idea of the gazetteer. Now, the complete Gazetteer of Cyprus formed part of the basis of one of my own recent, not that recent projects now, I think we finished 3 or 4 years ago, which was a project funded by the Anastasios Leventis Foundation, to whom we are very grateful, to essentially, beginning with the UN Complete Gazetteer of Cyprus, to map references to texts according not only to the spelling of the place name, that working down here, but also giving a range of metadata about when that attestation is published, who published it, what their thinking might have been. But every single record is tied to this top-level 1987 document, so that we essentially are producing this gazetteer in a way which reflects the scholarly diversity of the history of Cypriot place names, but which operates within an ethical contemporary framework, okay, which essentially obeys the law. So this is essentially a linked open data gazetteer, which, as I say, records different spellings of place names. Every single variation receives its own unique identifier, which is, in a sense, agnostic as to that spelling. It's simply expressed in a series of serial numbers, which kind of breaks down the sort of the partiality and the uncertainty around these things. What we haven't been able to do so well is represent the actual spatial footprints of the places referred to. So if I go back, so this is, for example, Nea Paphos, New Paphos. So we can say that Nea Paphos was referred to as Bapho in 1760 or whatever. It's much more difficult to make a decision as to what physical outline on the map that place name should actually be referring to. And this, I think, highlights the tension between the demands of accuracy that the internet has led us to expect of place names versus the actual historical accuracy of place names that we have available to us through traditional historical and humanities interpretation. So yes, there's another example. Essentially, we have a purely schematic representation of Paphos here, which probably doesn't represent anything as to the actual extent of Old Paphos, but we kind of use it as a schematic indicator. The reason this is an interesting example, so we have Paphos and Nea Paphos side by side there, is Paphos corresponding roughly to the modern village of Kuklia, which has its own entry in the complete Gazetteer of Cyprus because it's a modern place name. Paphos is a Bronze Age town, which is referred to as Paphos by later authors. We don't know the contemporary name of the town, of course. Then in the Roman period, the town moves west to the coast and is established as Nea Paphos, New Paphos. So this kind of gives us an example of the complexity of the history of place names and the way in which we kind of struggle to record these in a digital environment. But what we can do, going back to the spirit of that graph of the internet I showed, with the blue dots representing the spatial data sets, we would like to think the Heritage Gazetteer of Cyprus represents one of those blue dots. I think it'll be some time before it's big enough to show up on those sorts of graphs in real life. But what we can do is every single attestation of a place name that is made in our gazetteer can be referred back to, a source of authority. So in this case, this link, this particular spelling of Paphos, this Greek, this spelling in Greek, we can say that this was made between AD 70 and 100 by Luke the Evangelist, and then we can provide a link to the original text where that attestation is made. This is really important because this shows that we, as the authors of the project, are not making this attestation about Paphos, Luke the Evangelist is. So we can map chains of authority, we can map ways in which authority is established. The same principle can also apply to place names on maps. So this goes cross-media. It's not just about names on texts. So this is a wonderful example, I think, from the 1720 map of Pierre Moulin-Sanson. So we have Bapho coming up as a place name right there, the Temple of Venere, Temple of Venus, and so on and so on. Now, we can start beginning to link our data sets to other data sets. So we've been working with some colleagues of myself and Anna to integrate our gazetteer into a broader family of gazetteers via a project called Pelagios, which, in case you haven't come across it, is not a structured gazetteer in its own right, but is a format for different gazetteers to talk to one another. So we have implanted a bit of web code in our data set which allows our data to be expressed to Pelagios and then to be viewable alongside data from other gazetteers. So what you see here is our data set from Nea Paphos being displayed in the viewer of the Pelagios project. It's called Perikleo. Now, I promised you some telling of stories with GIS, so we can start doing that. We can start pulling data from the Heritage Gazetteer of Cyprus out and using it with other digital platforms. So, for example, I can pull out all the data of places identified as referred to by the British administrator in the 18th century, George Jeffrey, and we can start experimenting with geographic information systems visualizations with that data. So what we have here, again, apologies, this is a bit small, you probably can't read the place names next to these points, but we have here a set of points plotted from chapter 9, I think it is, of George Jeffrey's Monuments of the Island of Cyprus. And what I've then done is modelled what you can see from each of those points. So these are all points which he describes on his journey from, oh, my mind's gone blank, Parachorio down here up to Nicosia. So I think this broadly traces the route of his itinerary. What we have here are two monasteries on the other side of the Troodos Mountains, which he probably refers to in passing at some point, but didn't actually visit. But we can start seeing that as this itinerary progresses from south to north, most of his view would have been dominated by the kind of east-facing landscape there. So, you know, this is not something which I really have to go into time into. I don't have really time to go into now in terms of a close reading of the text, but it is one way into the text, and there's just a few alternative views there. So what I really want to debunk here is that the idea that gazetteers are only lists of places. They are infrastructures for understanding different views of places. And I think connecting to that early history of the gazetteer as a journalistic phenomenon actually works rather well in that regard. This is also what we might call spatial ontology, excuse me. I'm always worried that I'm going to like gulp or slur loudly into the microphone when I do that. I'm very glad I didn't. So essentially, the construction of a gazetteer is the construction of an ontology about the world. As Ptolemy would have understood it, it is the construction of a geographic view of the world. So we need to think about how these entities are created, and they can be created in all sorts of different ways. As information scientists, humanist scholars, information professionals, librarians, archivists, whatever, we are all creating spatial entities when we do our discursive work. Just to give you an example, just out of the blue as it were, this is a set of spatial entities created by the Luftwaffe of the city of Liverpool in 1943, where essentially the city has been sectioned out into zones for the purposes of bombing in this case. So this really, sticking to that kind of journalistic idea of the gazetteer, connects the construction of spatial entities with the idea of authorship. Okay, you know, we are writing gazetteers, we aren't creating them. And we can do this for all sorts of different reasons, for all sorts of different historical purposes. So this is one of my favourite examples. I'm currently working quite a lot on the literary history of London at the moment, particularly the vicinity of King's College London, because in, what century is this? 2029, we are having our 200th anniversary, our bicentenary. So we are having a big push at the moment to understand the role and the place of King's College as a London institution. And this is from a recent online archive, a recent online exhibition that the King's College Archive put on, of the Booth poverty map of London, if anyone has come across this. So what Booth did, he was one of these Victorian social reformers who sort of very keen on bettering the condition of his fellow man in the rundown inner cities, he classified various streets and areas of London according to how desirable that area was. So black is lowest class, vicious and semi-criminal, which is a rather subjective and pejorative way of looking at a section of society you want to improve, you might think. Going up to yellow, which is upper, middle and upper classes and wealthy. So there are no kind of quantitative or scientific brackets put in between these. By the way, I should add that the area now occupied by King's College, or as was then occupied by King's College, is classified as red, which is middle class and well-to-do, which I'm sure would make our principal very happy to think that that's how we were seen back then. But anyway, this is a very subjective ontological view of a particular area of London. So I would say that this kind of classification, this kind of spatial classification, epistemologically qualifies as a gazetteer structure, because it is, you know, a set of definable elements that you can see on a map which corresponds to a set of categories. You could also say that Charles Dickens, in his Notes from Boz, one of his earlier works, describes this area. This is actually the area right outside King's College, so, you know, fortunately it's a little bit better than that these days, but you know, this kind of sort of gives you an idea of what's going on. Now, the immediate layout of this area of London, I mean, this kind of graded spatial ontology, is very much a product of deliberate urban social design. And I do like to kind of introduce this to give an example of how complex the idea of breaking up the world into spatial entities can be and what the source of those entities can be. So I don't know if anyone knows central London very well, but this is Piccadilly Circus, one of the main kind of epicentres of London's fashionable West End. Here we have the trunk of Regent Street going up to the north and west towards Hyde Park. No, sorry, Hyde Park's here, isn't it? So where am I thinking of? St James's? I can't remember. Anyway, Oxford Circus is up here somewhere. So I've only worked in London 13 years, I should know these things. But what you can see is that here we have Soho, which kind of back in the 17th century was a very poor, one of those black areas on the Charles Booth map, very much black area, sort of the vicious lower class area. And the streets heading east into Soho are very narrow, which compares to the streets heading west into Fitzrovia here, Mayfair, which is the very posh, affluent, upper class area. Now that is very, very deliberate. John Nash, the urban planner and architect who laid out this area of London, said that his purpose in designing the streets going west and east of Regent Street was to separate the nobility and the gentry from, you know, the mechanics and the trading part of the community in Soho. He says his purpose was that Regent Street should cross the eastern entrance to all the streets occupied by the higher classes and to leave out to the east all the bad streets. Okay. There are lots of different ways in which we can understand the division of spatiality of our environment. And, you know, a properly employed gazetteer can help us to make that structure clearer. This, by the way, is a shot from OpenStreetMap, the crowdsourced map of the world. From the section where people can upload their GPS traces from their phones. I mean, for whatever reason, people like to take GPS traces of routes they've taken in various places and share them via OpenStreetMap. Usually I think it's runners, you know, showing how much running they do, that kind of thing. But you can see there is a lot of traffic heading up Regent Street here. This is Piccadilly Circus. A lot more heading to the west into Mayfair. And then you do have this kind of fairly barren strip going down to the east of Regent Street where there is much less footfall. So it's kind of unscientific. It's very much a self-selecting set of ways of looking at it, but this does show that John Nash's conceptual Gazetteer of West London is still working pretty well in the present day. Now, one little example I like to put alongside this is a project by the Scholars Lab in University of Virginia, which kind of sort of shows how the familiarity of places can help with things like recall and rhetoric. So what Scholars Lab did was they mapped all the place names in Homer's catalogue of ships into a gazetteer. So they basically created a list of places in the order in which the places appear in the catalogue of ships. The catalogue of ships, just to explain, is the chapter of the Iliad in which Homer essentially describes where all the ships on the beaches before Troy came from. And it's one of our key sources of reference for the geography of the ancient Greek world, the archaic Greek world. And what they discovered is the order in which the places are mentioned follow a very clear geographical logic, going from, in two cases, the north of Peloponnese, kind of in a southerly direction, past Corinth here, down to Epidaurus. And then here we have Argos, where the main kind of forces opposing Troy came from. And the place names actually follow a rather logical clockwise direction going around Argos. Now, this is to help people who have to memorize this chapter and recite it, remember the order that the places came in. As a Londoner, I use the London Underground every day. I get the Bakerloo line from Paddington Station down to Charing Cross Station. I am hugely familiar with this route. I can rattle off the order of the stations, so it's Paddington, Edgware Road, Marylebone, Baker Street, Regent's Park, etc., etc. This is exactly the same principle. People would have known this order of places from their geographical logic, and so this would have helped somebody charged with remembering the Iliad and reciting it to an audience not fluff their lines. So this is a way this kind of ontological, gazetteer-like understanding of the world can sort of help us in different ways. Now, as I said, web gazetteers play a very large role in the formation of the modern internet, but I hope that I'm instilling a certain skepticism about what those lists of places might be telling us. So take the GeoNames Gazetteer, for example, which came up in our discussion this morning. So this is an open, crowdsourced map of the world, effectively, in which anyone can contribute. So here we have a set of search results for a simple search for London. And this immediately shows that there are an awful lot of Londons in GeoNames, most of which refer to the London in the United Kingdom, but we also have a London in Canada, one in South Africa somewhere or other, Jamaica, and so on and so on. But these all essentially refer to entities of London which describe some sort of sub-gazetteer record. So inner London, outer London, central London, east London, Norwich for some reason, I don't know why that's there. London City Airport, Greater London. So somebody has to make a decision about what these things actually mean, whether that's spatially, as in that problem of mapping Nea Paphos, which I showed, or administratively, or indeed semantically. So that top result from London is essentially a point of one, literally one point. So with one latitude and longitude, which is actually slightly off the central meridian that shows there, with an authoritative place name with various bits of basic information attached. But this just shows how much kind of abstraction there is, how basic all that spatial information that's there on the internet is. Now, some projects have tried to make use of this abstraction by linking structured gazetteer data to more discursive humanities material. So this is a wonderful project at Stanford University, the Center for Electronic, Spatial and Textual Analysis, with which various of us have links. I do, Anna does, and various others you do. So what they've tried to do here is map different types of emotion in novels about Victorian London to points which can be associated with the experience of those emotions. And what this does, it's a crowdsourcing project, so I think users could contribute, contributions to, for example, where the emotion of fear is being described, or the emotion of happiness is being described. And so this tries to identify exactly which points in London are associated with fear, with happiness, with anxiety, and so on and so on. So I think this is quite an interesting conflation of this very quantitative, internet-friendly way of using gazetteers, a much more discursive, fuzzier, humanities-friendly way of thinking of gazetteers. I'm sort of on the home run now, so to say, but I want to try now to use the last few minutes to put an argument as to why this distinction between the internet-friendly gazetteer and the humanities-friendly gazetteer might help us understand the contemporary digital world around us. Now, this pops up in everyday life, in our everyday use the internet. So think of the role of a company like Google in mediating gazetteers to us as people who probably use Google quite a lot. I certainly do. So if you do a Google search for Jerusalem, you get an information box on the right-hand side which describes Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. Okay? That is not an incorrect statement. But it is not the only potentially correct statement that one might make about Jerusalem, depending on your political perspective. Now, if you click on this information box, it becomes apparent that this information is being drawn from Wikipedia, where you have a kind of nuanced, I would guess, quite carefully supervised view of the various different ways of describing Israel that exist. But the way this is being piped through to the top level of the Google search result, is rather partial. If I could invite a comparison of the careful nuancing of the complete Gazetteer of Cyprus and the way we tried to situate our lists of Cypriot place names in relation to that transparent ethical modern framework, that's not quite so much in evidence with Google. Sadly, I think Google probably gets more hits than our Gazetteer, so the influence it has is very much stronger. This is a topic which the internet geographer Mark Graham has written a lot about. This is a wonderful piece from Slate.com, which he wrote a while ago, in which he explores the algorithmic and human logic of why this might be. Of course, there is a lot of speculation involved here because Google's algorithms are tightly guarded corporate secrets, as it were. But anyway, these are all things to think about. We can also cite the works of feminist digital geographers like Monica Stevens, who has written extensively about crowdsourced gazetteers and crowdsourced geographic data, particularly data from the former Google My Maps service and OpenStreetMap. Now, the OpenStreetMap model is to have a new feature description added. I think it's 8 members of the community have to vote in favour of the feature being added, and if it attracts the support of 8 people, it gets put on. If anyone objects, it isn't. Now, Stevens notes that the vast majority of users of OpenStreetMap are white men, Western, relatively middle class, probably middle-aged, and so on. This demographic, therefore, exerts a disproportionate influence over what gets represented on crowdsourced gazetteers. So she cites numerous exchanges on the forum for and against including features which may have a more feminized presence, such as kindergarten. In this sense, it is voted off because it's considered that it is already represented. And she kind of lists some of the features which are approved, which she would argue, as you can see here, have a masculinized interest, versus the ones which were not approved, which has a more kind of feminized interest. So essentially, this digital space, which is supposed to be free and open and democratic and underpinned by ethically appropriate gazetteer structures, actually isn't. And sort of this leads us on to kind of acts that are out there in the kind of the Wild West, which are not approved by, I guess, any of the main corporations. Things like this one, which allows you to identify female Snapchat users in your immediate locality. Now, the developers of this app, whoever they might be, I'm not sure who they are, would probably have us believe that this is a bit of harmless fun, but it is no great leap of the imagination to suggest how it could be anything but. So, just to conclude, a lot of so much of our spatial thinking about the world is predicated on this idea of the subjective gazetteer structure, but we so often don't think of gazetteers as subjective. We think of them as authoritative lists of places, with authoritative associated information, with authoritative locations, and authoritative provenances of where they come from. I think we must always see them as, in terms of their journalistic subjective roots. We must always bear in mind that the source of the gazetteer might be the thief who stole the coin. It might be somebody with an agenda. It might be a corporation with an agenda. I would also say that for the use of gazetteers in the humanities and the digital humanities, we must bring the kinds of critical frameworks and questioning frameworks that as humanists, as archivists, as librarians, we all use every day. We must bring those to those gazetteers as well. I think I'm going to finish there. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you.
We would like to invite the audience for questions. I would have to ask you to use, because we're recording the session, I would like to ask you to use the microphone. First one?
It doesn't work.
Doesn't work, but it's on. Excuse me, I have to switch on and off. Now it does. Okay. Questions?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
Yes.
You first?
Thank you.
No. Just a simple question from your. Thank you for your very interesting talk. It would seem to me, coming from another discipline, that the World Wide Web has enabled us to share information electronically, so it connects us. Now, new technologies have enabled us to, such as the Internet of Things, to connect information with the actual places. How do you think that will affect your studies?
The short answer is very, very much. it's not just the Internet of Things. Of course, the Internet is now moved from things like this to things like this. So GPS is now a part of our daily lives. There is a whole another conversation to be had about how using the Internet in real time and real place kind of affects our own behaviour. And there's been a lot of work done on this. But I think the first part of your question kind of identified precisely one of the main issues here, which is the Internet is, and the World Wide Web, which of course are two different things, is a connecting medium, not a mapping one. So it deals with getting a message from point A to point B in exactly the same form very, very well, like an email. It doesn't deal with maps so well. And I think exactly the same issue applies with the mobile Internet. And quite frankly, companies like Google are stepping into the breach, or have stepped into the breach, and have kind of taken commercial control of that agenda. So I think a big part of the future research in this field will be on the, the ethics of control and, and privacy and citizens' rights and so forth. And I have colleagues at King's who spend all their time doing this.
Thank you.
Okay, Alexandra, Heather?
Thank you very much for a fantastic talk. Very inspiring, actually. Well, what I have been thinking about as a sort of linguist, a language person, is also how we represent languages and maps, Like, how do we map? Just like thinking about, for example, Sweden. So probably, like if you map Swedish on a world map, so perhaps like the whole territory, or maybe some of it in Sweden will be, like labeled Swedish or something like that. But even if you have a look at the room here, so perhaps we speak lots of different languages, although we are in Sweden, but we are somehow not represented. And I just wonder, I think it is a question of actually aggregating data, but somehow we do jump from language speakers to territories. We somehow think in those categories, and I'm not sure how would we do instead of doing like that, but if you have any comments, or if you...
Yeah, I mean, linguistics is one of those areas which kind of really challenges the whole field of mapping. I would say, one thing you might want to look at is how the field of literary cartography is approaching this, because I think some of the issues are quite similar. I mean, not entirely similar, but for example, Tania Rossetto, who is a cartographer, no, she's not a cartographer, she's a literary critic who is interested in literary cartography, talks about post-representational cartography, i.e. maps which don't just represent on a point-by-point basis what's going on in the text, but which represent kind of mind map-like truths of what's going on in a text. So that kind of approach might be more useful to somebody like yourself, where, a map which just has Swedish here, Norwegian here, something else here, is inevitably going to be incredibly simplistic and maybe useful if you're trying to explain your work to an outside audience, but not if you're trying to explain it to another expert. So I think these kind of post-representational literary cartographies would be much more interesting to somebody like yourself. But it also shows that kind of the conventional mapping that the Internet is very good at, one of the very basic things that it's very good at, is probably has limitations for the sort of work that you do. Sorry.
No, that was an intriguing comment. Probably has limitations. Could you elaborate that?
Well, just that I think the kind of, I would guess, very sophisticated linguistic nuances that somebody like Alexandra works with, just a map which works in points, lines and polygons, which is the basic grammar of a map, is inevitably going to reduce that to something much less sophisticated than it actually is. So it comes back to your point about communication. If you're just wanting to communicate a general point to a non-expert, that can be very useful. But I guess if you're trying to communicate a nuanced expert point, it could actually be very counterproductive to use that kind of mapping.
Yes.
Can I add something that to your? I'm not Stuart, but I just to add on the sort of like mapping processes. I think another problem is that it also very much depends on the humanistic research question, the way you use map. Because I mean, Alexandra is using it in one way, is using maps in one way, an archaeologist might be using maps in a completely different way. And us that we're doing classical studies and there's already an infrastructure for it with linked open data could be something completely different too. So limitations is one thing and openness is another, but they're all very related, I think, when it comes to research, to the humanistic research question and what you're actually trying to find out with the map. So the level of granularity could be one thing that zooms into like one particular area or question of one area, but perhaps a point map might not be as useful for the same person.
Well,
Exactly.
yes, and one aspect of what you pointed out is also the identification and sort of the rights to one contribution and the traceability. So it's that needs to be addressed.
Yeah.
And the technologies for that as well.
Yeah. Exactly, because that is a process of linking and communicating, and that's again something that the web is very good at. Although, as I think my Cyprus example showed, it is rubbish at Cartesian mapping in the normal sense. I mean,
the web is good at that in relation to the when we connect to things.
Yeah.
We have a problem because the linking is done somewhere else, not connected to the artifact.
Yeah.
More questions? I have a question that has to do with sustainability and maintenance, which is what we've been looking at the HSABA or together. When we're thinking about gazetteers and building gazetteers, there's already so many other or earlier gazetteers, even so non-digital. So say, for example, somebody wants to make a gazetteer about a specific area in a specific Caribbean island, and there is already, say, gazetteers about it from the early 20th century. So how do we go about incorporating all that knowledge? What's the most inclusive way to go? Because I mean...
Well, you can either be Google and digitize everything in the world.
Yeah.
That's one approach. You're not Google. I would think the thing to start with is to look at what digital material you do have. So if you may not have a digital copy of your 17th century Caribbean island map, but you may have a record in the catalogue of the library here, which might be exposable online, so you could link to that. So even if, as with Luke the Evangelist, you can't click on the link and go through to Perseus Digital Library, you can at least go and see where that attestation has come from. Because, the library catalogue here has the authority of the University of Uppsala behind it, so it's reliable. I think probably, to go back to your question, I think reliability is probably the main thing that you'll be looking for first. So, yeah, and in terms of longer term sustainability, I think you just have to be as minimalist as you can in terms of what you publish. I mean, what's the phrase? What is that phrase that developers use? Is it over-publish, under-receive, I think, something like that. It's not quite the phrase I'm looking for. I'll remember it at 3 o'clock tomorrow morning, but it's essentially publish as little as you can and receive as much as you can. That's the kind of the principle of web development.
I'm really sorry about the rave partying that is going outside. It's very unfortunate. I didn't think that up here we would hear it so much.
Okay, my office overlooks the Strand, not London, and we're always getting protests. And,
It's just like
people are usually throwing things outside my office, so it's just fine.
Well,
There is one.
sorry, do you want to go first?
No?
All right. So in terms, So if we should publish it, if I want to make my own gazetteer, say we have a digitized map, and a sort of ontology where I want to build a sort of discourse where I want to build a gazetteer, but we should also publish as little as possible. So how do we go about this?
Well, when I say publish as little as possible, is I guess publish as little as your needs your needs require. So, you know, if you're wanting to make the outcome of your research available, you know, you would just publish what your resources and your website can easily deal with. So if, you know, you are doing it in a kind of belt and braces way of doing it, you know, you would probably just publish the core data, you know, like the location, you know, place name or whatever, just to go to Anna's point, to make sure that it's as easy to sustain as possible, because the bigger and more complicated something is, the harder it is to keep going. And that's what every DH centre in the world is struggling with, I think.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry.
No, I was just thinking about your point about Google, because one thing that Google does is indexing the web. The other thing is that, of course, it has digitized a lot of material and stored in its platform. But then the question arises, where do we keep records of things in the past? And you mentioned this library, but do you have thoughts on where we could use the things like the web to archive versions of what it contained before?
Sure, that's a really good question. Well, I think with a kind of a web gazetteer or web database structure, you can archive versions in exactly the same way as you would archive the original collection. You just give it a separate identity number, and you can have a hierarchy or a flat network or whatever works best for you. So yeah, I mean, I think it depends on, well, you know, how many versions there are, how, you know, what it is you want to index, and what you want to treat as an object. You know, whether you have digitization at the scale of just the catalogue record, like Anna's Caribbean map, or if you have, or if you have, you know, full digitization of a volume with full metadata about page numbers. I mean, you know, the amount of complexity you can represent is unlimited, basically. I think it just depends what's useful, what you need it for.
What's the humanities research question?
Yeah.
What's the spatial analysis question? It depends. It's adaptable, right?
Yeah.
We had in the morning, I should jump in and say that in the morning we had a very informal panel with Alexandra and several other people in Sweden that are working with language GIS, sort of Sweden and abroad, Austria and the UK, just trying to sort of figure out, to discuss what issues we have. And there were several different things, but also many common ones. So there are some things that are general, such as maintenance, sustainability, where do we store things, how do we link data, and all of that. But then other things depend on the research question, I suppose, as well. Or that's my impression, at least, with the projects I've been involved in, and I've seen. Any more questions? Just one last question from me. You spoke about the reliability of the library as an organization. Would you mind expanding on that a little bit in the British context?
In the British context,
or King's maybe context.
Well, I mean, it was really a general point. I mean, you know, it was in response to your question, which was, you know, what should I do if the material I want to refer to isn't digitized? I mean, you know, we would probably tell most of our students not to reference Wikipedia in an essay, right?
Oh, yes.
It's exactly the same principle. You know, you probably wouldn't want to reference Wikipedia, you know, if you were putting out a formal digital publication. What I say to my students is actually Wikipedia can be very useful for some things as long as you use it critically and don't treat it like an authoritative secondary resource.
Yeah.
So actually in the same sense, the Wikidata version of Wikipedia could be quite useful for your purposes because it identifies individual entities in a way which, you know, shouldn't be too controversial. But you would treat it exactly the same as, you know, a reference that you would make in a paper you want to submit for publication in a reputable journal. You know, you're not going to want to point to something which might turn out to be wrong.
Yeah.
You know, if, you know, there is a uu.se domain.
Yeah, exactly.
So if there is something in that domain, a record in that domain, it's got the authority of this institution behind it, in a sense.
Of course.
Yeah, so it's about reputable sources as in any other academic context.
And we need libraries.
We do. Sometimes even books.
Well, I say at this point we should thank
Thank you
Stuart
very
Dunn
much.
for visiting us.